Also, the other thing I wanted to mention, just because this is the biggest platform I've ever been on, and I want to put this out there, I really don't like the current consensus internet classification of beginner, intermediate, advanced, of basing that solely. Well, I don't like basing it on solely rate of progression, right? Because rate of progression is multifactorial. If someone's eating 40 grams of protein a day and sleeping for 2 hours, they might plateau at a 1 plate bench. But I think that it would be insane to call them intermediate, right? And I've always kind of proposed, and like, but we like to have easy classifications because it's really useful. It's kind of like we all kind of want to put stuff in boxes, and I want to know what I am, right? Especially when I was younger, I understand that, but I've always kind of proposed, like, can we at least make it more of a rating of process, right? Like if we have this, holistic idea of what needs to be done to get stronger, like sleep, nutrition, training, technique, intensity, whatever it might be, nailing your recovery variables outside the gym. I think that needs to be factored into whether we're advanced, right? Because you said the other day on your podcast something I couldn't agree with more, which is like, there are some guys who are competitive on the world level who I would not classify as more than intermediate, right? But what makes them intermediate? To me, it's the fact that they don't even have their process dialed. It's the fact that their technique leaves a lot to be desired. Their events are very inefficient. Their diet sucks ass. There's a million things they could do better. And that's what makes them intermediate, not necessarily the rate of progression. Because you could also, I think, have advanced lifters that I would definitely call advanced go through these spurts of insane progress. And they didn't suddenly become an intermediate, right? So I just think that looking to rate of progression as our determinant doesn't always make sense, especially because the number of people I know personally who have plateaued at very low levels of strength and been like, oh, I got to move to an intermediate program. Like, no, you need to address something outside the gym. And that 5x5 program will continue working wonderfully. I promise you.
That's a fantastic point. It's such a hard balance to strike because you need more dimensions to be able to analyze training if you want to be able to predict from the individual, not just like a group. What do we get over an aggregate, but like you as an individual, how I'm going to get you from point A to point B in the surest way possible. So I think of it like this, because that type of classification, I want to say, is very heavily perpetuated by like Ripito and the practical programming universe. And that's how they explain their process, which is 5 more pounds. So from the day you start lifting, every workout's the heaviest workout of your life. And we're not training you in a way where you're going to get stronger and then that dictates improvement. It's the opposite. We're using progressive overload as the thing that's growing you, which a lot of effective programs do. But you can kind of, you can go on an Eastern type program, an Olympic lifting type program, and they're not trying to drive strength forward by having you move more weight. They just want you to hang out in these thresholds. And once you get stronger, you're justified in moving the weight up. But they want to keep this tight little incremental jump. They're like white knuckling the program start to finish, and it's effective. But yeah, you need to understand the dynamic between recovery and stress so that when you do plateau on starting strength, it's like, well, why did I plateau? Well, in their mind, they're thinking of where people run into that brick wall because they've gotten strong enough to where that pacing is not sustainable anymore. But that's in the context, and context is everything, of a very particular method of training. And you can't just take that and apply it to a run-of-the-mill block periodization type split, or what you might think of as a modern kind of specialized powerlifting split where you are doing everything 2, 3, 4 times a week and you're undulating across that. It is very different. And the dimensions that you do need, and it's surprising it doesn't really get pointed to more. The extra dimensions you need is how serious is the lifter? Because people talk about programs. And even as I speak right now, I kind of feel like an idiot over all the programming videos I put out, that it's like certain programs are implied to be for people that have their shit dialed in. And to this day, it's like, well, can I do Smolov with bench and deadlift at the same time? Or can I, I'm working 60 hours of construction a week, or I'm doing this or I'm doing that. And it's like, there's a huge difference between what's going to work for somebody who's just hanging on by a thread to get through the day, and somebody who's like working for a state sponsored program and they get a stipend and they sleep 8 hours a day. And you got guys in lab coats writing down every time they take a shit to like figure out exactly where the recovery is. And you're absolutely right. I think that absolutely is a primary determining factor. Even for myself, as I've chipped away and gotten good, I have no illusions about it. I've gotten good in spite of screwing off in a lot of areas. Like I can be open about that. And then when I infuse my experience with the different programs I've done, the injuries I've had, what I've done to get out of them, being on gear, not being on gear, all that other shit. It's like, yeah, it's not enough to be talented. It's not enough to work hard. It's like, you got to do all of that. And you also have to be good and you have to plan. It's that's entirely true. And I think a lot of people look over that.
When I think what you said about like forcing progressive overload, right, is really interesting, right? Because like if we want to call it like beat the books, like log booking, right? Like it doesn't need to be 5 by 5. It could be whatever arbitrary reps and sets. But the idea of either we're adding weight or we're adding reps every single week, going to try harder than we did last week. I think that has a lot of utility, right? Especially for people who don't have sporting backgrounds. I think that this aggressive beat the books approach is a good way to have accountability for intensity and really calibrate their RPE, right? Is if you've never run gassers and you've never done like maybe an athletic background, you don't know what maximal exertion necessarily feels like. And we have like a little bit of good literature to support this idea that people really are not all that accurate about gauging their reps in reserve, right? Which is like, I've always kind of like been like, I think that's a little irresponsible. Like, yes, training at 3 RIR is very efficacious early in a training cycle, but most of the people watching a very popular channel definitionally probably don't know what 3 RIR really feels like, right? Because like the bigger a channel gets, the more you're catering towards the beginner, because there's more beginners than there are intermediates, and there's more intermediate, or I have that backward, and there's less advanced people than there are intermediates, right? So it's like the bigger a channel gets, right? And to get a channel big, you need to start catering towards these more new populations. But we should bear in mind who we're speaking to when we have a big channel. These new populations do not know where 3 RIR is. And I think that maybe going through a phase in training of, that aggressive beat the book style, and really help people get a gauge for, oh, wow, I'm a lot more capable on my accessories of pushing way further than I thought to. And that's like a necessary lesson for a lot of people. And I think that maybe sets apart who makes it from X strength level to Y strength level, but then going from Y to Z is who can stop doing that, right? Because Mike Tusher, who, I think is a genius, he put up an Instagram story a long time ago that I really liked, where he's like, the longer I've coached, the more I've liked the idea of using training as like a gardening analogy rather than a machine analogy, rather than trying to make yourself do 5 more pounds or 1 more rep. You can't force progressive overload, right? You can't force adaptation. All you can do is put yourself in an environment that's conducive to adaptation. So, sufficient protein intake, sufficient caloric intake, sufficient sleep, and then training with a technique and a intensity and a volume and frequency that's conducive to it. But you can't force it, right? You can't force a rate of progression necessarily. And I think that's a transition that's necessary to make. Is the guy who goes from, I don't want to, like, numbers are really specific to the individual, but the guy who goes from a 2-plate to a 3-plate bench, there's a good chance he got there just because he was training harder than the other guy and pushing himself that much harder, right? But that's might not be the determining factor for going from 3 to 4. At that point, it's like, how to train hard. Everybody at this point knows how to train hard. Now you need to train a little smarter and know what is actually driving progress, not just blind effort and like just throwing the kitchen sink at your program. Like any exercise you can think of that feels like it might help the bench press, I'm going to do all of them, right? At some point, you're going to get hurt, right? You need to fiddle that down into what is the bare minimum, right? And I've always thought there was an interesting transition to make, is like getting to a certain level of strength, man, you could just effort your way there, right? And then those guys who can't progress past that point, because if they try to do what they did to get there, they fall apart because they're not moving a lot of weight.
Yeah, there's people who accidentally, I always say that when I'm trying to reverse people's expectations, because a lot of people that submit inquiries for training or programming or whatever will present themselves, I don't want to say disingenuously, but maybe they themselves don't have an idea of where they are on the totem pole. And there've been a couple of times where I have to use some creative language to drive home the point of, this is where you are. And I have to say, like, look, there's construction workers that accidentally get stronger than this. There's CrossFitters that accidentally get stronger than this just by virtue of a certain amount of work, a certain amount of effort, and some stimulus, because the human being is very, very low relative to kind of natural homeostasis levels. Like, it doesn't take a lot to get someone who's new very strong. But to your point, I agree with the stress component being more important early on, like assuming that, technical decay isn't rampant, but there are enough different avenues where you can have people work hard. They can recover from it faster. It is important. It's that learning experience. You don't want to wait till you're a 700-pound squatter to know what RP10 actually feels like. So directionally, it should go the other way around. And then as you develop, that transition you were talking about logically should have more of your training be submaximal, or at least more of your at least have your maximal style training or harder efforts or greater workouts be kind of carefully selected, few and farther between. And that's what training smarter is. What always just grinded my gears was the fact that none of this is explicitly stated anywhere. And you can read through any textbook you want, and this context doesn't exist. Practical programming was probably the closest that laid it out. Like, the stronger you are, the more careful you have to be with your touches. And then it's not until you develop so far into the future that it's like, oh shit, yeah, I get like really crazy tendinopathy if I try to train at the same volume. Or it's like, oh, my strength levels day to day just go like this, depending on how I slept and all this other shit. So I can't even follow a predictable like rate of an increase. And I was listening to the Barbell Logic guys. I listened to them for a while. Matt Reynolds, and he is very heavily involved in that. And they had this like way of thinking, because I was talking about them white knuckling it, going from 5 or 3x5 several days per week, and then just carefully shifting out, like, okay, now we're doing more recovery work. Now it's going, instead of every couple of days, every week, then every other week, then every 3 weeks. And their logical progression took them all the way to like block periodization, where you're doing like once every 12 weeks. And it's like, okay, but everything you're doing in the 12 weeks doesn't have anything to do with that heavier workout. So you're already removing yourself away from the weight being the thing that drives up your strength. Now you're having to rely on the other stuff. And then you brought up Mike Tusher, like the flat loading he talks about and the stuff he picked up from Bondarchuk. That was a light bulb moment that came too late in life, where I'm like, you know, what is the minimum workout you need to be able to foster growth? And they're like, oh, well, you can just do this stuff you're kind of not used to, and you'll grow a little bit. But then you can do like the exact same thing for a couple of weeks, and you're still going to kind of grow a little bit. And it really was like, Jesus Christ, like, I don't need to be hitting the gas every single workout. In fact, that's the opposite.